All right, Alexander Hamilton was born in Nevis in 1755. He was born of a woman by the name of Rachel. He thinks his father was Jim Hamilton, but he's not exactly sure. He doesn't really know who his true father was. Back in Nevis, they actually had a Danish law, and the Danish law was that if you committed adultery twice and weren't living with your husband, you could be thrown in jail. Rachel was thrown in jail. It's really neat to read books like this to discover all the cool laws that we used to have that we don't have anymore. I'm being sarcastic. He learned to speak French. He also learned to hate slavery. He was in a sugar plantation. The slaves were treated horribly. And the only way the slaves could be kept in line when they outnumbered the white people by 5-1 would be beaten, flayed alive if they tried to rebel, and burned at the stake. So he saw slavery up front. He hated it. He was a primary abolitionist, and he was one of the few founding fathers who was always against slavery. That's something that's very much in his favor. He learned how to speak French, which is interesting because in the American Revolution, our primary allies were the French. And so he could converse with Lafayette in the French very well. And eventually he became essentially chief of staff to Washington. And so in that position, he was able to coordinate the French and the American resistance to the British. This is a family tragedy, and I want you guys to understand how he grew up. So I will read this actually family tragedy. Let us pause briefly to tally the grim catalog of disasters that have befallen these two boys, Alexander Hamilton and his older brother James, between 1765 and 1769. Their father had vanished, their mother had died, their cousin and supposed protector had committed bloody suicide, and their aunt, uncle, and grandmother had all died. James, 16, and Alexander, 14, were now left alone, largely friendless and penniless. When you start reading history, you discover a lot of the people who have a burning desire and ambition to achieve something in life have had miserable, miserable childhoods. It's a predominant thing that you find the more and more of these founders that you look at. Now, how did he manage to get out of Nevis? Well, he had a hurricane. A massive hurricane came through, and he actually got published in the newspaper a rendition of that hurricane. And I would like to go ahead and read that to you so that you can realize how he got ahead in life was by the quality of his opuscules. Where now, O vile worm, is all thy boasted fortitude and resolution? What is become of thine arrogance and self-sufficiency? He's talking about the hurricane. Death comes rushing in triumph, veiled in a mantle of tenfold darkness. His unrelenting scythe, pointed and ready for the stroke, see thy wretched helpless state, and learn to know thyself. Despise thyself and adore thy God. O ye who revel in affluence, see the afflictions of humanity, and bestow your superfluity to ease them. Succor the miserable, and lay up a treasure in heaven. This guy's about 15 years old, and he's writing like this. Gets published in the newspaper, and everyone says, this guy needs an education. It's a waste to keep him down here amongst all of us savages. And so a big collection goes up to send him to get an education at Princeton, where he goes and he says, I really don't think I should take 4 years to go through this program. I would not like to apply unless I can come in as a sophomore and complete it in 3 years. And the Princeton guys say, well, as brilliant as you are, we don't really like that attitude. We're not going to admit you. So then he goes up to King's College, which eventually becomes Columbus College in New York. And it's called King's College because it's a hotbed of Toryism. That's where all the people who are loyal to Britain are currently. Well, not all of them, but a good majority of the New Yorkers love Britain. The revolution comes fairly quickly. When he's up there, he's about 20 years old. And does anyone know what happens on April 18th, 1775? That's when Paul Revere runs through Boston saying, the British are coming, the British are coming. The British go out to Concord to try and steal all of the arms that the Sons of Liberty have been hiding out there. And this is the first volley in the Revolution. About 176 Americans end up getting killed, and about 800 British get killed in that violence that happens on that night. And so pretty soon the country is torn apart. You have newspapers that are pro-British, and you have newspapers that are pro-revolution. And which do you think Hamilton is printing his stuff in? He's printing for revolution. He becomes a fiery orator for revolution, for throwing off the shackles of the British. And so he starts his career being anti-British. And in fact, he volunteers in the Sons of Liberty in order to fire cannon. He becomes one of the captains, or actually I think it's a second lieutenant, of about 40 people who join the artillery, and he learns how to fire cannons. So he has to go find some cannons because he doesn't have any, so he has to go steal some from the British in order to actually get some cannons for him to command. And then the way that it worked back then is he couldn't just come in as a second lieutenant. He had to get 20 or 30 or 40 people to enlist beneath him so that therefore he could command them. And he had to supply his own uniforms and pay for all of the uniforms of all the people who were working with him as volunteers to fight the British. So he does that by becoming an orator, by speaking out against the British, by becoming known as a person that other people can trust, and by being so good at that that they all want to be led by him. So he is what's called a grassroots organizer, and he does a good job of actually getting his own uniforms and his own cannon in order to be able to volunteer to join a war. That's the way things used to be done in this country. So he gets noticed. He gets noticed by a lot of generals who want to start promoting him, because not only does he know how to fight and he knows how to drill, and he's read every single book over at King's College about tactics, and he's interviewed all of the British soldiers when they're in the bars drinking and telling them all of his tactics, but he gets noticed, and eventually he becomes chief of staff of Washington. And this is a brilliant career move for him, because Washington is a very able administrator, and he's tall, and he's handsome, and he has everybody's confidence, and he can organize all of the states to actually make donations to the cause, because under the Articles of Confederation there is no central state, there is no central taxing authority. In fact, there's not even people who fight for longer than 6 months. They all enlist for 6 months and then they all disappear. So how do you fight a war when you train people, you finally get them good after 6 months, and then they all disappear to go home to maybe show up again later? Especially when you can't pay them, you can't give them blankets, and it's hard to find any ammo. And the British are shooting at you. It's a pretty tough position. But Hamilton, as Washington's chief of staff, is able to pull everything together and make it work. And he does a great job of helping to win the war, until he gets tired of being in the back office. And he decides, you know what, as much as I'm helping to win this war, I'm not really facing the bayonets. And I want to be a war hero. Someday I want to run for president. I want to be a war hero. So he manages to arrange a conflict with George Washington, in which George Washington insults him for not coming on time, and he says, well, if that's the way you're going to be, I don't think I can continue to work for you. And then basically George Washington apologizes and says, I'm sorry if I offended you. And Hamilton says, well, I don't care that you're apologizing, I appreciate the fact you're doing it, but I just can't work for you anymore, I resign. So that he could then go get a commission to lead the next charge at Yorktown and actually attack at Yorktown some of the British who are in a fort that's fully entrenched, that has pillboxes, and that's shooting at him. And this is sort of like what Theodore Roosevelt does when he's Secretary of State later on, many, many years later, and he wants to lead the Rough Riders in an attack upon Cuba. So he arranges for the war to happen and then resigns in order to lead it. That's the way our leaders used to be. But let me go ahead and read to you about this. This is pretty cool, if I can find it. Well, I'm not going to be able to find it fast enough. But let me just suffice it to say he ran right into the bayonets of the enemy, who happened to be the British, and in order to avoid having somebody in the night alert them because it was a surprise attack, they actually took all of the bullets out of their guns. So they actually crawled underneath the fire, put up a starburst at night so they could finally see the enemy, and then they attacked face to face with bayonets and took 2 different forts that were on the outskirts of the fence line at Yorktown, and he led the charge. It's pretty heroic stuff. I'll have to come give you a second speech in which I have that part memorized. So then what happens? After the war is won, he decides, or actually during this process, he decides to get married. He gets married to Eliza Hamilton, and not in this order, but he eventually has 6 kids. He was married December 1780. Eliza Hamilton stuck with him through thick and thin. She was a fabulous woman, and he finally got some respectability by marrying into a family that everyone knew their lineage. Because remember, he's an illegitimate bastard. Illegitimate bastard for truth. Not just what people call him in order to disparage him, but in fact, that's what he was. But now he achieves some legitimacy. And so what are the lessons that he wins as a result of having this war and being chief of staff? He figures out the Articles of Confederation are lousy. They were lucky to win. Essentially, the United States was bankrupt at the time that they won the war because every state was sending out their own bonds in order to finance the war. And the bonds were trading at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. And most of the soldiers had been paid in these bonds that were basically worthless. It's like paper money without the backing of the United States. So who was the next president? The first president is George Washington. George Washington is elected, and George Washington knows one person who knows how to save the United States, and that's his good buddy, Alexander Hamilton. So he brings Alexander Hamilton in as Secretary of the Treasury and essentially turns the entire running of government over to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton establishes a Coast Guard. He has to establish a Coast Guard because the only way to collect taxes is off of the ships that come to trade from Britain. So interestingly enough, the Sons of Liberty started the war because of taxation on tea. As soon as Hamilton won the war, the only way to finance paying it off was to establish tariffs on tea. So instead of the tariffs going to the British, the tariffs were going to the nascent United States. Now, before Washington could actually bring in Hamilton to do that, they had to get the Articles of Confederation replaced by the Constitution. Who do you think led the effort to get the Constitution ratified? Well, Alexander Hamilton was key to that effort. He was the writer of a majority of the Federalist Papers, and the Federalist Papers identified and explained every single aspect of the Constitution. Every single line had to be justified in order for it to be sold to the states. The states had to ratify it, and the state of New York was not anxious to ratify it. That's where Alexander Hamilton ended up. And even though he was a principal writer of the Federalist Papers and argued vehemently for the Constitution, he played a waiting game to make sure that everybody else ratified it because the New Yorkers were going to vote it down. The people in charge of the New York state were going to vote it down, so he played a dilatory waiting game to make sure that Virginia came in with the 10th vote and embarrassed the New Yorkers into saying, well, shoot, now that it's going to be the law of the land, we might as well join. Because they were going to vote no. And if they had voted no, there may have been other states that may have voted no. So he was instrumental in getting the Constitution ratified by New York, using his political pull and his strategies as a lawyer. Once he's in office, under Washington, he says, we need a central bank. And in order to justify a central bank, because remember, all of the states very much want their own power. They all have their own governors who think their own presidents. He has to make them want to become part of this union. So he says, I'm going to adopt, or the United States is going to adopt all of your debts. All of the debts that you had previously issued to fight the war, we're going to take those over. And what happened is all of the soldiers, or a good majority of them that came from the South, didn't like the fact that they had sold these worthless pieces of paper, these bonds that they thought that were only worth 10 cents on the dollar. They had sold them to speculators up in New York for 15 cents or 20 cents on what they should have been paid. So now the people who were going to get rich from having all of these payments made were the New York speculators. They didn't like that. They didn't like it at all. And they accused Hamilton of favoring the money class, of favoring the merchants over the Southern farmers, who ended up being the soldier class, or the majority of the soldier class. To sell that, they had a big compromise. The South wanted the capital in the South. The North wanted it in New York. So as a compromise, they all agreed that the capital would be in a portion of Virginia, Washington, D.C. Well, then, really it was Philadelphia, and then eventually going to be moved down to Washington, D.C. But in exchange for keeping the capital in the South, they agreed to the assumption of all the debt in the North. That was the first big compromise that was critical to the start of our nation that he engineered as Treasury Secretary. He was essentially running the whole government, as Washington was more or less a figurehead, allowing him to do everything that he wanted. Similar to, you know, how Jim Como runs this whole organization. I take all the credit. So I have run out of time.
That was a good one.
Hey. So I have run out of time. So this will be Alexander Hamilton #1, and maybe I can finish the rest of the book when I give you Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.